Somewhere around 130 million years ago, in a part of the sky nobody was looking at, two dead stars fell into each other. They had already burned out. What was left of them was matter squeezed so tightly that a single spoonful would weigh as much as a mountain. They circled each other for a very long time, and then they touched. In that instant, in a flash lasting less than a second, the collision manufactured something in the order of 10 times the mass of the Earth in pure gold. Almost all of it is still out there. A small amount of it is on your hand, or in your phone, or 80 feet under Manhattan, behind a door that weighs 90 tons. Every civilization that has ever existed has wanted this metal. Not most of them, all of them. People who never met, who did not know the others existed, separated by oceans and by thousands of years, all reached the same conclusion about the same element. They could have chosen iron, which builds things. They could have chosen copper, or salt, or shells. They chose the one metal that does almost nothing at all. This is the story of why, and it is not the story you would expect, because the answer is not really about people. Nothing on Earth was made on Earth. That sounds like a riddle, and it is not one. It is the plainest fact in chemistry, and it is where any honest account of gold has to begin. The Earth did not manufacture its own materials, it gathered them. Every atom of iron in a nail, every atom of calcium in a bone, every atom of the carbon that makes up almost everything you have ever touched was made somewhere else and arrived here already finished.
Most of it was made inside stars.
A star is a furnace that spends its life squeezing small atoms into bigger ones. It starts with hydrogen, the simplest thing there is, and fuses it into helium, and when the hydrogen runs low, it starts on the helium and so on up the ladder. Carbon, oxygen, neon, silicon. That process built almost everything ordinary about the world, and it is generous, and it goes on for billions of years. But it stops at iron. There is a hard ceiling built into physics, and iron is where it sits. Fusing atoms together releases energy, all the way up to iron. After iron, it costs energy instead. A star trying to make anything heavier than iron is spending more than it earns, and a star that does that dies. So the ordinary machinery of the universe, the thing that has been reliably producing matter for 13 billion years, simply cannot make gold. Gold sits far past that ceiling. It is element number 79, which means 79 protons crushed into a single nucleus, all of them positively charged, all of them violently repelling one another, held together by a force that only works at unimaginably short range. You cannot build that gently. You cannot build it slowly. Nothing in a working star will ever assemble it. To make gold, you need conditions so extreme that they only occur when something very large dies badly. For most of the 20th century, the assumed answer was supernova, the explosion of a giant star at the end of its life, a blast so violent that for a few weeks a single dying star can outshine an entire galaxy of hundreds of billions of others. That seemed like enough, and you go, folly, there's not. The better answer, and the one the evidence has been pointing at for the last decade, is stranger and more specific. It involves neutron stars. When certain very large stars collapse, what is left behind is not an explosion and not a black hole. It is a remnant, and the remnant is the densest material that can exist without disappearing altogether. Gravity crushes the atoms out of existence. The electrons are forced into the protons, and what is left is neutrons, packed against one another with nothing in between, no space, no gaps, none of the emptiness that makes up almost all of ordinary matter. The result is a star roughly the size of a city and heavier than the sun. The numbers are difficult to hold in your head, so here is the usual comparison, and it is accurate. A single spoonful of neutron star material would weigh about as much as a mountain range. Now, sometimes these things come in pairs. Two neutron stars orbiting each other, circling for millions or billions of years, each one a dead city-sized weight. And as they circle, they very slowly leak energy, and their orbit very slowly tightens, and they spiral inward across ages. At the end, they are going round each other hundreds of times a second, and then they touch. What happens in that instant is the most violent event the universe is currently capable of producing, outside the beginning of everything. The two remnants tear each other apart. An enormous quantity of neutron-rich matter is flung outward at a serious fraction of the speed of light. And in that spray, in a window lasting less than a second, atoms are built at a speed that nothing else in nature allows. Neutrons are jammed into nuclei faster than those nuclei can fall apart, and the ladder that stopped at iron is climbed past it in a single leap. Gold is made there, platinum, uranium, all the heavy, strange, valuable things. We are not guessing at this. In 2017, instruments on Earth detected the gravitational waves from exactly such a collision. Two neutron stars, somewhere between 85 and 160 million light-years away, spiraling in and merging. Telescopes turned to look at the afterglow, and in the light of that fading fireball, astronomers found the fingerprints of freshly manufactured heavy elements. The estimates of how much gold that single event produced run into several times the mass of the Earth. We should be careful here, because this is a live scientific question, rather than a settled one. There is a difficulty. When astronomers count how often neutron stars appear to collide, the rate seems too low to account for all the gold we can actually see in the universe. So either these collisions are more common than we can currently detect, or something else is also making it. That argument is not finished. What is not in doubt is the general shape of the answer, which is that gold requires a catastrophe. Now bring that home, because this is where the chapter turns. The Earth formed out of a cloud of dust and gas, and that cloud already had gold in it, seeded there by deaths that happened long before there was a sun. But when the young Earth was still molten, something inelegant happened. Gold is very heavy, and it likes iron. So as the planet separated itself into layers, almost all of the gold went down with the iron, into the core, thousands of kilometers beneath your feet. There is enough gold in the Earth's core to plate the entire surface of the planet, land and sea, in a layer half a meter thick. It is completely, permanently unreachable. The gold we can actually get at, all of it, everything in every vault and every ring and every wire, is thought to be a much later delivery, a long bombardment of asteroids that struck the Earth after the core had already formed and the door had already closed. It is, in other words, a residue, a scattering of debris left on the doorstep after the main shipment had been locked away. And here is the turn. Gold is the most earthbound thing we have. It is the symbol of solidity itself. When people want to say that a thing is real and heavy and cannot be faked or argued with, gold is the word they reach for. It is what you fall back on when you have stopped believing anything else. And it is the only material in the whole human story that did not come from here. The iron in your blood was made in a star. True. So was the calcium in your teeth. But those are ordinary products of ordinary stellar life, made constantly, everywhere, by the usual workings of the universe. Gold is not ordinary. Gold requires two corpses to collide. Every wedding ring is debris from a catastrophe that happened before the sun existed. Every coin ever struck is fallout. The most solid, most reliable, most reassuringly physical substance our species has ever agreed on is a delivery of wreckage from somewhere unimaginably far away, arriving late, by accident, on a planet that had already finished burying its own. Den stinkudbok hårbarna stoting stinklasty or snaking your toe meffing of fired.
And it has not changed since.
That is the other half of it, and it will matter enormously later. The gold made in that collision 130 million years ago is chemically identical to the gold in a Roman coin and to the gold in a phone made last week. Not similar, identical, not one atom of it has altered in the whole time. There is nothing else in the human world of which that is true. Everything else rots, rusts, burns, weathers, or turns into something else. Gold arrived finished and has been sitting there ever since, waiting, doing nothing at all, being exactly what it was. Which raises an obvious question, and it is the question the rest of this video is going to spend 2 hours answering. If it does nothing, why did we ever look twice? Because somebody did. Long before anyone could smelt iron, before writing, before the wheel, before any of the civilizations whose names we know, someone bent down and picked a piece of it out of a riverbed and turned it over in their hand and decided that it mattered. We can put a date on that, roughly, and we can visit the place where they buried it. In 1972, on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria, a young man was operating a digger. His name was Raicho Marinov. He was 22 years old, and he was cutting a trench for a cable on an industrial site outside the city of Varna, in ground that nobody had any particular reason to care about. He noticed things in the spoil, small, bright, obviously not stones. He gathered up what he could find, took it home in a shoebox, and left it there for several days before showing anyone, which is, when you think about what he was holding, an entirely reasonable thing for a young man to do. What Raicho Marinov had cut into was a cemetery that had been sealed under that soil for 6,500 years, and it contained the oldest worked gold ever found anywhere on Earth. We need to be careful about the word oldest, because it is used loosely, and it matters here. This is not the oldest gold. Gold does not age. This is the oldest gold that somebody deliberately shaped, melted, hammered, cut, drilled, and made into things. The graves at Varna date from between about 4,600 and 4,200 years before Christ. Take a moment with that, because the number is almost impossible to place. This is before the pyramids, not slightly before. The Great Pyramid would not be built for another 2,000 years, which is a longer gap than the one between us and the Roman Empire. It is before Stonehenge, before the wheel, before writing exists anywhere in the world, which means these people are, by definition, prehistoric. We will never know a single one of their names, or what they called themselves, or what language they spoke. It is before bronze. The technology of the moment was copper, and these people were among the best coppersmiths alive. And in this cemetery in a corner of Europe that no textbook treats as a center of anything, archaeologists eventually recovered around 6 kilograms of gold across roughly 300 graves. That figure needs context to mean anything, and the context is startling. For that period, that one cemetery held more gold than had been found in the rest of the world put together. Not more than any other site. More than everywhere else combined. So the first great concentration of gold in human history is not in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is in a fishing and trading community beside a lagoon on the Black Sea, whose name we do not know, who left no writing, and who then vanished. But the quantity is not the interesting part. The distribution is. Because the gold is not spread evenly across those 300 graves, most of them have little or none. A great many people at Varna were buried the way people had always been buried, with a pot and a tool and not much else. And then there is grave number 43. Inside it lay a man. He was about 40 to 45 years old when he died, and unusually tall and strong for the period, and by every indication he had eaten well his whole life. He was buried with more than 990 gold objects, weighing something over 1.5 kilograms. Did it? Gold on his arms in heavy bracelets, gold discs sewn onto clothing that has long since rotted away, so that the discs were found lying in the shape of a garment that is no longer there. A gold-handled axe, and the axe is important because it is ceremonial. It was never meant to cut anything. Beads, plates, rings, a platèse sewn along the body from shoulder to foot, and, famously, a gold sheath made to fit over the man's genitals. That last detail tends to get a laugh, and it should not be dismissed as an oddity, because it is telling you exactly what the gold is doing. This is not decoration. This is a statement about power and fertility and lineage, made in the one substance available that would never tarnish or decay. One man, in one grave, wearing more concentrated wealth than existed in most of the known world. Now think about what that actually means, because this is the moment the whole human relationship with this metal begins, and it begins in a way that has almost nothing to do with money. There is no currency at Varna. There is no market, no coinage, no economy in anything like the sense we mean. Nobody there is using gold to buy grain. And the gold in that grave has been taken permanently out of circulation. It is put in the ground with a corpse. It will never be worn again, traded again, or used for anything by anybody. That is an enormous, deliberate act of waste. A community that could have kept all of that and shared it instead chose to bury it forever with one man. Which is precisely the point. The value of the gesture comes from the fact that it is a sacrifice. Anyone can be given something. Being the person for whom the community destroys its own treasure is a different kind of claim. Archaeologists have a dry phrase for this moment. They call it the emergence of social stratification, the point at which a society stops being roughly flat and starts having a top. And what is remarkable about Varna, what makes it worth an hour of anyone's night, is that we can watch it happen. We are looking at one of the earliest clear pictures anywhere on Earth of the invention of inequality. 300 graves, most of them ordinary, a handful of them extraordinary. Somebody at Varna 6,500 years ago worked out that a person could be made permanently, visibly, unarguably different from their neighbours. And when they went looking for a way to say it, they said it in gold. Here is the turn, and it is the one that sets up everything that follows. We tend to assume gold became precious because it was money, that the story runs. First it is a commodity, then it becomes currency, then because it is currency, it becomes desirable. Varna says the order is the other way round. Gold was precious 4,000 years before anyone struck a coin. It was precious before there was any economy for it to be precious in. Its first job was not to buy things. Its first job was to say something that could not otherwise be said. But this man is not like the others, that this family continues, that this power outlasts the body it is buried with. And it could do that job because of one specific physical property, which is the same property this whole video keeps circling. Gold does not change. Copper corrodes. It goes green, and at Varna they knew that perfectly well because they were expert coppersmiths. Cloth rots. Wood rots. Bone eventually goes. The man in grave 43 is largely gone. The gold came out of that soil in 1972, looking exactly as it had looked when it went in, 6,500 years earlier. Bright, unmarked, finished. It had outlasted the man and his family and his language and his people and every single thing they ever built. Their entire civilization disappeared so completely that we do not even have a name to call them by. The gold is in a museum in Varna, and you can go and look at it, and it looks new. They were making a claim about permanence, and they chose the only material on Earth that could actually keep the promise. Which brings us to the question this chapter has been circling, and it is the real question of the whole video. Why gold? Not why did they want something precious that is a human constant and it needs no explanation. Why this? They had copper, which is beautiful when new. They had shells, which are rare and hard to get, and were traded across enormous distances. They had bone and stone and coloured pigment. Verilebidu snooper at Varna and everywhere else, and every one of those lost. And it is not just Varna that is the thing to hold on to. Over the next 4,000 years, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and China and India and Peru and Mexico, in societies with no contact whatsoever with one another, the same competition ran again and again with the same result.
Never Teeth like teeth is not a test. Taste is not reliable. Nothing else in human culture converges like that.
Something about this specific metal was forcing the answer. Found out what, we have to leave archaeology behind entirely and go somewhere that at first looks like the least likely place in the world to find the reason people kill each other.
We have to go to the periodic table.
There are only ever two candidates.
That is the answer, and we are going to spend this chapter earning it, because it sounds like an exaggeration and it is not one. It is a arithmetic. Here is how to think about the problem. Imagine you are not a person in a particular culture with particular tastes. Imagine you are simply a species anywhere, and you need a substance to carry value. Something that will hold what you have earned, so you can set it down and pick it up again later, and so that a stranger will accept it. You are not choosing a favorite, you are filling a job vacancy, and the job has requirements. It has to be durable, because value you cannot store is not value. It has to be portable. It has to be divisible, so you can split it without ruining it. It has to be recognizable, so nobody can pass you a fake. And it has to be scarce enough to be worth something, but common enough that there is some of it about. Now go to the periodic table and start crossing things off. There are about 98 elements that occur naturally. That sounds like an enormous field of applicants. It is not. Start with the 11 that are gases at room temperature. Hydrogen, helium, nitrogen, oxygen, the halogens like fluorine and chlorine, the noble gases. Every one is disqualified immediately, and not for a subtle reason. You cannot carry them. You cannot hand one to a merchant. A jar of colourless gas is indistinguishable from an empty jar, which makes it the worst possible currency ever devised.
Cross out 11.
Now the liquids. There are only two, and one of them is mercury, which is a beautiful and mesmerizing thing to look at and will poison you steadily while you carry it. Bromine is worse. It corrodes and it burns skin. Now the reactive metals, and this is where the list starts falling apart in a hurry.
The whole left-hand column of the table, lithium, sodium, potassium, and the rest, is out, and out spectacularly. These are metals that catch fire in water. Sodium dropped in a pond will skitter across the surface and explode. Your life savings must not do that in the rain.
The column beside it is barely better. Magnesium burns with a light so bright it was once used for photographic flashes. Calcium corrodes in damp air. Cross out about 25. Now everything radioactive, all the actinides, uranium and thorium and the rest, and much of the tail end of the table, these decay. A currency that gives you cancer while you save it has a fundamental design flaw, and beyond that, it slowly stops being itself, which defeats the entire purpose.
What out about 30 more?
Now use common sense on what is left. Some elements are far too common. Aluminium is one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust. A currency that is lying around everywhere is not a currency. There is an interesting wrinkle here that proves the rule. For a brief period in the 19th century, before anyone worked out how to refine it cheaply, aluminium was more valuable than gold. Napoleon III is said to have kept aluminium cutlery for his most honoured guests, and given everyone else gold. The moment the refining process was solved, that value evaporated completely, and today, it is what a drink's can is made of.
The word scarcity was never optional.
Some elements are the opposite problem, so rare that you could not build a money supply out of them if you tried. Rhodium, and osmium and iridium exists in such small quantities that there would never be enough to matter. Then there is the melting point, and this is the requirement people forget, and it is decisive. To make a coin, you have to melt the metal. That is not a detail, that is the entire technology, and you have to be able to do it with a charcoal fire and a pair of bellows, because for most of human history that is the only heat anyone has. Titanium melts at over 1600 degrees. Tungsten melts at over 3,500, which is the highest of any element. Nobody was casting tungsten coins in Anatolia in 600 before Christ, or anywhere else, until the 20th century. Cross out most of what remains. And now look at what is left standing on the table. There is a small cluster right in the middle, in a region chemists call the transition metals: iron, copper, lead, nickel, silver, gold, platinum, a handful of others. Iron and copper and lead all fail on the same point, and it is the point this whole video turns on. They corrode. Iron rusts, and rust is not a stain, it is the metal being eaten. Copper goes green, lead dulls and is poisonous besides. Platinum fails on 2 counts. It is far too rare to be a money supply, and it melts at 1700 degrees, which put it entirely out of reach until modern furnaces, which is exactly why no ancient civilization used it, despite the fact that some of them had it in the ground. Which leaves you with 2.
Silver and gold. That's the whole shortlist out of 98. Everything else on the periodic table removed itself, for reasons that have nothing to do with human beings and everything to do with physics.
And now consider what happened next, historically, because it is precisely what you would predict. Silver and gold both became money everywhere in parallel for thousands of years. Bimetallic systems, gold for large sums and silver for small, are the norm across the entire ancient and medieval world. Both candidates got the job, because there were only 2 applicants. But over the very long run, gold pulled ahead of silver, and it did so for one reason. Silver tarnishes. Silver reacts with tiny quantities of sulfur in the air, and it slowly goes black. That is why silverware needs polishing. It is a slow reaction and a mild one, but over decades and centuries it is real, and it means silver is very slightly conditional. It needs looking after. Gold does not do this. Gold does not react with air, or with water, or with almost any acid. There is a specific mixture of acids that will dissolve it, and it had to be discovered deliberately, and the alchemists who found it named it royal water, because it was the only thing that would touch the royal metal. Left alone, gold does nothing forever. A gold coin lost in a field in the 2nd century, ploughed up in the 21st, comes out of the mud looking as if it was struck last week. There is no other substance in the human world of which that is true. And then, on top of all of that, there is one final property, and it is almost unfair. Gold is gold-coloured. Look at a tray of metals, and every single one is grey. Silver is grey. Iron, tin, lead, zinc, platinum, titanium, nickel, grey, grey, grey. There are exactly 2 coloured metals in the entire periodic table: copper, which is reddish, and gold. And the reason for it is genuinely astonishing. Gold has 79 protons in its nucleus, which is an enormous positive charge. The innermost electrons are pulled so hard by it that they orbit at a serious fraction of the speed of light. At those speeds, Einstein's relativity stops being an abstraction and starts having consequences. The electrons behave as though they are heavier, their orbits contract, and that contraction shifts the energy levels inside the atom, just enough that gold absorbs blue light instead of reflecting everything back. Take the blue out of white light, and what returns to your eye is yellow. So gold is yellow because of relativity. It is, in a real sense, the only place in ordinary life where you can look directly at a consequence of Einstein's physics, and people have been staring at it since before we could write.
Now put it all together, and here is the turn.
We did not choose gold. We have told ourselves for 5,000 years that gold is precious because we decided it was, that value is a story we agree on, and that this metal is the story we happened to pick. It is not. Run the elimination and the answer falls out before human beings enter the room. The requirements of the job disqualify 96 of 98 candidates on physical grounds alone, and of the 2 survivors, 1 is slightly worse.
Every civilization that ever ran this experiment got the same answer, because it was never really an opinion. They were all handed the same periodic table.
And now the part that should be uncomfortable. Look again at why gold won. Not because it is strong, it is soft, and you cannot make a blade or a plough or a bridge out of it. Not because it is useful. For almost all of history, it did nothing at all, and it is only in the last century, in electronics, that it has done any real work.
This great, yes, that's done friction.
Gold won because he does not react.
Its qualification, the single property that beat every other element on the table, is its refusal to participate in anything. It will not rust, will not burn, will not combine, will not change. It sits there. Iron built the world. Iron is worth almost nothing. The metal we chose to carry everything we own is the one that does nothing at all, and it was chosen for exactly that reason, and the reason was never really ours to choose. So the chemistry is settled. There were 2 candidates and 1 winner, and it was decided before anyone. But that only explains why gold was available to become precious. It does not explain what human beings then did with it, and the first great civilization, to get its hands on serious quantities, did something with it that nobody expects. They did not spend it. The first great gold empire never made a single coin. That is worth stating plainly at the start, because it cuts against everything we assume. Egypt held more gold than any other power in the ancient world, for longer than any other power has held anything, and for nearly 3,000 years it did not occur to anybody there to spend it. Egypt's gold came mostly from the south, from the deserts east of the Nile, and from Nubia, the land beyond the first cataract. The Egyptian word for gold was Nub. The land was called Nubia. We are not certain which name came first, and it hardly matters. The country and the metal were the same word. We have an extraordinary object that shows how seriously this was taken. It is a papyrus, now in Turin, drawn around 3,100 years ago, showing the road to the gold mines in the eastern desert. It marks the hills, the routes, the wells, the settlement where the workers lived, and the places where the gold-bearing rock was found. It is a geological survey map. It is the oldest one that survives anywhere in the world, and it was made because a state wanted to organize the extraction of gold on an industrial scale. The work itself was appalling. We have a description from a Greek writer of mines that were probably being run in much the same way for thousands of years before he saw them. Men and women and children working underground in shafts cut through hard rock. Fires lit against the rock face to crack it. Prisoners of war, criminals, and the families of criminals condemned to it collectively. The rock was carried out, crushed by hand in mortars, ground on stone querns, and washed on sloping boards until the gold separated. He describes people working under guards who did not speak their language, so that no kindness could pass between them, until they died there. That is the first great gold operation in human history, and it is the pattern for every one that follows. This is worth remembering later when we get to California and to the Rand, because nothing about it changes. So Egypt had gold in quantities nobody else could match. There is a letter from a foreign king to a pharaoh, part of a famous diplomatic archive, in which the king asks for gold and points out, half flattering and half exasperated, that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust. He was asking for it because he wanted it. Everybody wanted it. And here is the question that matters. What did Egypt do with all of it? They did not mint it. There was no Egyptian coinage until the very end of the story, under Greek rulers, and by then the pharaohs of the pyramids had been dead for 2,000 years. The Egyptian economy ran on grain and on barter. Wages were paid in bread and beer. Quite literally, a workman's ration was reckoned in loaves and jars. Larger transactions were valued against a standard weight, and that gave people a way to compare a cow with a bed. But no coin passed hands. Gold in Egypt was not a medium of exchange. It was something else entirely, and to understand what, you have to understand what they thought it was. Egyptian religion held that the gods had flesh of gold and bones of silver. Not that gold was like the gods, or symbolized them, or was pleasing to them. That divine bodies were made of it. The sun god's skin was gold. Gold was a piece of the sun which crossed the sky each day and was reborn each morning, and which was therefore the one thing in the universe that visibly died and came back. And the reason for that belief is not mystical at all. It is chemical, and it is the same property we have been circling since the first chapter. Gold does not corrupt. Now put yourself inside a culture that spent more thought, effort, wealth, and engineering on the problem of death than any society before or since.
Det despisont beartestation. But put lochem bodzer. The remnant soul wifty.
Everything in Egypt decays. That is the fundamental fact of the place. The Nile floods and recedes. The body rots. The desert takes back whatever is not defended. The entire vast apparatus of Egyptian funerary religion, the mummification, the tombs, the offerings, the spells, exists to fight decay. And here is a substance that simply refuses to take part in it. You can bury gold with a body for 3,000 years and open the chamber, and it will not have altered by so much as a shade. Everything else in that room will have gone. The linen will be brittle, the wood cracked, the paint faded, the man himself a husk. The gold will look like it was made that morning. To a people obsessed with permanence, that is not a pleasing quality, that is proof. Gold behaves the way they believed a god behaves, untouched by time, unchanged by death, immune to the process that takes everything else. So they used it accordingly, not to buy things, to make people permanent. Which brings us to the object everybody knows. In November 1922, in the Valley of the Kings, a team broke into the tomb of a pharaoh who had died young and been largely forgotten, and who had the extraordinary good fortune of having been buried somewhere that robbers never found. Tutankhamun was a minor king. That is the detail people miss. He ruled for about a decade and died around the age of 19. And he was not a great conqueror or a great builder, and his tomb was small and hurriedly finished. Inside it were more than 5,000 objects. The innermost of his 3 nested coffins is solid gold. Not gilded, solid. It weighs around 110 kilograms, which is roughly the weight of a large man, and it is a portrait of the boy inside it. Over his head and shoulders was a mask, again solid gold, inlaid with lapis and carnelian and coloured glass, weighing about 10 kilograms. It is the most recognisable object from the ancient world, and it exists because a 19-year-old needed a face that would not rot. And this was the small tomb. This was the one nobody thought worth robbing. Try to extrapolate from that to the tombs of the great pharaohs, the ones who ruled for 50 years and conquered half the region, all of which were emptied in antiquity. The scale of what has been lost does not really have a number attached to it. We think of Egyptian gold as treasure. It was not treasure, it was equipment. That coffin was not put in the ground because gold is valuable and a king deserved valuable things. It was put there because the Egyptians believed the body had to survive in order for the person to survive, and gold was the only material available that would keep its side of the bargain. They were not being extravagant. By their own logic, they were being practical. They had a specific engineering problem. How do you make a man last forever? And they used the one substance on Earth that does not decay. And here is the reversal, which sets up everything in the next 4 chapters. The greatest concentration of gold in the ancient world was deliberately, permanently removed from the economy. Every gram of it was sealed in a chamber in a cliff, guarded, cursed, and never intended to be seen again by any living person. The most gold-rich society in history spent 3,000 years taking gold out of circulation and putting it underground, which is the same thing that happened at Varna, on a scale 1,000 times larger, and for the same reason. And it is, as we will see at the very end of this video, the same thing we are doing right now. Gold's first function was never exchange, it was permanence. It was the material you used when you needed to say that something would not end. But a substance that permanent, that portable, that universally desired, is not going to stay out of the marketplace forever. Somebody was going to notice that everyone wanted it, and that everyone agreed it was worth having, and that this made it far more useful than any amount of grain. It happened about 600 years before Christ, in a small kingdom in what is now Turkey, on a river that had a legend attached to it. And the invention that came out of it changed the world more than any object on this list. It also quietly made gold itself unnecessary, though nobody would notice that for another 2,500 years. Money is not a thing. Money is a solved problem. And to understand the solution, you have to understand the problem first. Imagine a market before coins. This is the world for the whole of the story so far. Varna, Egypt, Mesopotamia, everywhere. You want to buy a cow. You have gold. Excellent. But now the two of you have to do some work. First you have to weigh it, which means someone has to own a set of scales, and the two of you have to agree that the scales are honest. Then you have to establish how pure it is, because gold as it comes out of the ground is rarely pure, and a lump that is 9 parts gold is worth a great deal more than a lump that is 6 parts gold, and by eye they look identical. Then, if the cow costs less than your lump, you have to cut it. And once you have cut it, the two halves need weighing again. Every single transaction is a small metallurgical investigation. It is slow, it requires trust, and it rewards whoever is better at cheating. That is the problem. And around 600 years before Christ, in a kingdom called Lydia, on the western edge of what is now Turkey, somebody solved it. Lydia had a river called the Pactolus, and the Pactolus carried gold. Not gold that anyone dug for. Gold that simply washed down out of the mountains and lay in the sediment, in grains and small nuggets, free for the gathering. It made Lydia rich for no reason except geography. The Greeks, who lived next door and noticed it in Yukonik, they said had been granted the wish that everything he touched turned to gold, and had discovered rather too late that this included his food, his drink, and in the crueler versions, his daughter. To be rid of the curse he was told to wash in the Pactolus, and the gift went out of him and into the river, and the river has carried gold ever since. It is a very good story about wealth that ruins the person who has it, told about a real river that really did carry gold, in the kingdom that really did invent money. The Greeks were not subtle, but they were rarely wrong about what mattered. What the Pactolus actually carried was not pure gold. It was electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, pale yellow, sometimes almost white. And electrum had a specific and maddening property that turns out to be the mother of the whole invention. The proportion of gold to silver varied from one grain to the next, one riverbed to the next. The mix was different. It might be 70% gold. It might be 40%. And there was no way to tell by looking. So the Lydians were sitting on a fortune in a substance whose value nobody could assess, which meant that every trade was an argument, and the man who knew more about metal won it. The Lydian kings did something about that, and the thing they did was the invention. They took electrum, made it into small lumps of a fixed and standard weight, and struck those lumps with a mark. The earliest ones carry a simple design, and later ones a lion's head, the royal emblem. The mark was the king's guarantee. It said, "This piece is the weight it looks, and the purity it should be, and I say so, and if it is not, the fault is mine."
That is a coin.
And what it removes from the transaction is the reason it changed the world. Nobody has to weigh anything. Nobody has to assay anything. Nobody has to trust the man in front of them, because the trust has been moved off the individual and onto the state. Two strangers who have every reason to cheat each other can now trade in seconds. The kings of Lydia became proverbially rich on this, and the last of them, Croesus, is still the byword. Rich as Croesus is a phrase in English 2,500 years after the man died. He also made the second great improvement.
Croesus worked out how to separate electrum into its parts, using a process with salt and heat that pulls the silver out and leaves the gold behind. So instead of a coin of unpredictable alloy, he could strike two coins, one of pure gold, one of pure silver, at a fixed and known relationship to each other.
That is the first bimetallic currency in history, and the model for essentially every monetary system on Earth for the next 2,500 years. The idea travelled fast because good ideas about money always do. Within a couple of generations, the Greek cities were striking their own. Persia took it. Then everybody. Croesus himself came to the sort of end the Greeks enjoyed writing down. Contemplating war against Persia, he sent to the oracle at Delphi to ask what would happen. The oracle replied that if he attacked, a great empire would be destroyed.
Because other things he can mean is I think he can get in subtrolute. And then the global Mary has been nitric and beauty. That's the job. Good in and exactly all that. I mean,
okay, what so then you?
Yeah, I yeah. A great empire was destroyed. It was his.
Now, here is the turn, and it is the quiet one that runs underneath the rest of this video. Look closely at what the Lydian invention actually did. Before the coin, a piece of gold was worth what it was. Its value was in the substance, and any competent metalworker anywhere in the world could confirm it, and it needed no authority at all. After the coin, a piece of gold in your hand is worth what the mark on it says. And those two numbers are not the same. A coin, from the very beginning, was worth slightly more than the metal in it, because the convenience of not having to weigh and test was itself worth paying for. That gap between the metal and the mark is small at first, and it is the most important gap in monetary history. Because once value lives in the stamp rather than the substance, a door has been opened that cannot be shut. If people accept the coin because of the mark, then the amount of gold behind the mark becomes, in a quiet way, negotiable. Not immediately, not obviously, but the logic is now in place, and every government that ever handles money will eventually find it. You can put a little less gold in and keep the same mark on top. Nobody in Lydia was thinking that. They were solving an honest problem honestly, and they solved it brilliantly. The stamp was invented to guarantee the metal, not to replace it. But the moment the guarantee existed, the metal started to become the less important half of the arrangement. That is the reversal of this chapter, and it takes 2,500 years to fully play out. At the exact moment gold became money, it began the long process of becoming unnecessary.
Every step from here runs in the same direction. Coin, then coin with slightly less gold. Then paper that promises gold. Then paper that promises gold you are not really expected to ask for. Then paper.
The story of gold from Lydia onward is the story of the mark slowly eating the metal. And the first people to discover the taste of it were the ones who built the largest state the Western world had yet seen, and who needed to pay an army that was too big for their revenue. They did not do it maliciously or all at once. They did it a fraction at a time, over 200 years, each emperor solving that year's problem and passing on a slightly emptier coin. By the end, the money of the Roman Empire contained almost nothing at all. Every currency in history has died the same way, and Rome is where we can watch it happen in the most detail, because Rome left us the coin. That is the useful thing about a coin. It is a small metal document. It carries a portrait so you know which emperor issued it, and it carries an amount of precious metal which can be measured now, 2,000 years later, with great precision. So the Roman coinage is a continuous economic record minted year by year that cannot lie about itself. And laid out in order, it tells a story that has almost nothing to do with battle. Start at the top. The Roman system, once it settled, had a gold coin called the aureus and a silver coin called the denarius, and the denarius is the one ordinary people handled. A legionary's pay was reckoned in it. A day's work for a labourer was about 1. Under Augustus, at the start of the empire, the denarius was around 95% silver, effectively pure, a good coin, made honestly. Now watch what happened. The first man to reduce it was Nero in the 60s of the 1st century, and it is worth understanding why, because the reason is boring, and it is the reason every time. The empire's costs were rising. There had been a fire in Rome that needed rebuilding. There were armies to pay, and there were the ordinary swelling expenses of a state that keeps growing. Revenue was not rising to match. Nero's mint reduced the silver content slightly and made the coin a touch lighter. Not dramatically, enough that nobody rioted. And it worked. That is the crucial thing. It worked perfectly. The same amount of silver now produced more coins, the bills were paid, and no one seemed any the worse off. A tool that works and appears to cost nothing will be used again. Over the next 2 centuries, it was used by almost every emperor who needed money quickly, which is to say almost every emperor. Each reduction was small, each was defensible, each solved a real and immediate problem. A war, a rebellion, a plague, a donative promised to the troops on the day of an accession. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the denarius is down to about 75% silver. By the 200s, it is nearer 50. Then it falls off a cliff. By the middle of the 3rd century, in the period historians call the crisis, the coin that had once been nearly pure silver contained around 5%. Then, 2. At the end it was a copper disc with a wash of silver on the surface, applied so that it looked right when it left the mint. The wash wore off in circulation. People were being paid in coins that visibly turned into copper in their hands. And here is where the arithmetic turns on the state that was doing it. Rome's largest single expense, by an enormous margin, was the army. Something in the region of half of all imperial spending, sometimes much more, went on soldiers' pay. These soldiers were not stupid. When the coin they were paid in stopped being worth what it had been, they demanded more of them. Emperors, who needed those men not merely to defend the frontier, but to keep them personally alive, gave in. So each debasement raised the cost of the army, which required another debasement, which raised the cost again. And the emperors were not secure enough to stop, because in that century an emperor who displeased the legions was killed by them. In the 50 years of the 3rd century crisis, there were more than 20 emperors, and almost all of them died violently. Every one of them had a strong personal incentive to pay the troops today, and no incentive whatsoever to worry about the currency in 10 years, because he was not going to be there in 10 years. That is not corruption. That is a machine working exactly as its parts were arranged. The consequences arrived on schedule. Prices rose steeply and then wildly. Trade across the empire began to shift back toward barter and payment in goods because no one wanted the money. Taxes started being collected in kind, in grain, in cloth, in labour, because the state itself no longer trusted its own coin. Diocletian tried to fix it by law. He issued an edict fixing maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, with death as the penalty for exceeding them. It failed completely, as such measures always do, and for the reason they always do. The problem was never that merchants were greedy. It was that the money was empty, and no law can put silver back into a coin. Now here is the part of the story almost nobody knows, and it is why this chapter is about more than decline. The gold coin, the aureus, was also debased and disrupted in this period, and then one emperor did the opposite of everything his predecessors had done. Constantine, in the early 4th century, introduced a new gold coin called the solidus, around 4.5 grams of gold, high purity, fixed. And then it was kept fixed, not for a reign, not for a century. The solidus, and the Byzantine coin that descended directly from it, held its gold content essentially unchanged for something on the order of 700 years. 700 years, think about what that means in practice. It means a merchant in the 10th century could accept a coin struck in the 4th century and know exactly what he had. It means contracts could be written across generations. It means that for most of the medieval period, in a Mediterranean world that had otherwise fallen apart, there was one thing everybody would take. It became the reserve currency of the medieval world. Traders in places that had never heard of Constantinople accepted it. It has a fair claim to being the most successful money ever issued by anyone. And it was successful because of a decision to stop doing the easy thing. The turn in this chapter is not that Rome fell. Rome fell for many reasons, and the coinage is only one of them. And anyone who tells you an empire collapsed because of a mint is selling something. The turn is this. Rome could not be beaten in the field. For centuries there was no army in the world that could take it on and win. And even in decline, the legions kept doing extraordinary things. What defeated the Roman monetary system was not an enemy. It was a series of entirely reasonable decisions taken by intelligent men, each solving a genuine crisis, none of them able to see the sum of the others. And the thing they were quietly spending over 200 years was the one asset a currency has that cannot be minted, the belief that it will still be worth something tomorrow.
Order.
Gold was what saved the eastern half, and it saved it not by being powerful, but by being fixed. The solidus worked because everybody knew nobody was going to touch it, which is the whole argument for gold in one coin. Its value is that it cannot be created by decision. A ruler can print, promise, decree, and debase, But he cannot manufacture gold, and everyone knows he cannot. And that is the entire point. That is the case gold has always made for itself, and it is a genuinely strong one, and we will see it made again in Britain, and at Bretton Woods, and by people this morning. So far, though, everything in this story has happened in one connected world. Egypt, Lydia, Rome, all trading with each other, all inheriting each other's ideas. It would be reasonable to suspect that the whole thing is simply one long chain of cultural transmission, that gold is precious to us because it was precious to them, all the way back. There is a way to test that, and history ran the experiment for us. There was another half of the world. It had been separated from this one for something like 15,000 years, with no contact, no trade, no shared stories, and no idea the other existed. And when the two halves finally met, they discovered they had reached exactly the same conclusion. There is an objection to everything you have heard so far, and it is a good one, and it deserves a proper answer. The objection is this: every civilization we have looked at is connected. Egypt traded with Nubia and with the Levant. Lydia sat between Greece and Persia. Rome inherited from all of them. Ideas move along those roads as easily as goods do. So perhaps gold is not special at all. Perhaps one group of people, a long time ago, happened to like it, and the preference spread the way a fashion spreads, and everything since has been inheritance rather than discovery. Yet another serious argument. It would mean the value of gold is arbitrary, a very old accident, faithfully copied. Fortunately, this is one of the rare questions in history where a genuine, controlled experiment exists. Because there was another half of the world. At the end of the last ice age, when the sea rose and closed the land bridge, the Americas were cut off. From roughly that point until 1500 and something, the two halves of the human species had no contact at all. No trade, no travellers, no shared myths, no shared crops, no shared diseases, which is exactly why the diseases were so catastrophic when contact finally came. Two separate populations of human beings, running for something like 15,000 years in complete isolation, on separate continents, with separate plants and animals and gods. That is a natural experiment of a quality historians almost never get. If gold's value is a cultural accident, the accident should not repeat. The Americas should have picked something else. They picked gold. The great civilizations of the Andes and the Inca most of all, because they are the ones the Spanish met and described, treated gold as the supreme material. So did the peoples of Mexico and Central America. So did the goldsmiths of Colombia, whose work is among the finest ever produced anywhere. Not similar to how we treated it. The same. And here is the detail that makes this chapter more than a coincidence, and that turns it into evidence. The Inca had no money. None. No coins, no currency of any kind, and no marketplace in the sense the old world would recognize. The Inca economy ran on obligation and labor. You owed the state a portion of your work. The state stored and redistributed, and vast quantities of goods moved around an empire of many millions without anybody buying anything. They had no monetary use for gold whatsoever. There was nothing to spend it on. It could not be exchanged, because there was no exchange. And they wanted it anyway. They mined it, panned it, and worked it with extraordinary skill. They covered temple walls with it. The great Sun Temple at Cusco had a band of gold running around the outside of the building, and a garden containing gold models of maize plants, made stalk by stalk and leaf by leaf. They put it on rulers in tomes honored. They called it, in the phrase that has survived, the sweat of the sun. Silver was the tears of the moon. Now hold that against Egypt. Egypt, on the other side of a planet neither knew existed, separated by 15,000 years and an ocean, believed that gold was the flesh of the sun god, that it was solar, divine, and connected to the thing in the sky that dies each evening and returns each morning. Two civilizations with no possibility of contact looked at the same yellow metal and independently concluded that it was a piece of the sun. That is not culture. Cultures do not converge like that. Cultures produce wildly different gods, different burial rites, different foods, different notions of beauty, different everything that is what makes them cultures. But show two isolated populations the only yellow, imperishable, sun-colored metal on the periodic table, and both of them will tell you it is solar and sacred, because there is genuinely nothing else in the physical world it resembles. The chemistry we walked through earlier was not an interesting aside. It was the cause. Both halves of humanity were handed the same periodic table, and both ran the same elimination, and both arrived where the elements pushed them. The old world then went one step further and made it money. The new world did not, because it had no need of money. Which is the cleanest possible result. It separates the two things that are usually tangled together. Gold's value is not derived from its use as currency. The Inca prove that, because they had no currency and valued it exactly as much. Currency was something we added later, on top of a value that already existed. There is a second American piece of evidence, and it sharpens the point even further. The peoples of the Andes did have things they used as a kind of high-value trade good in the coastal societies further north. But what they treasured above almost everything, in some places above gold, was a particular kind of warm water seashell, traded enormous distances up the coast. So they had a locally invented, purely cultural precious object. It existed alongside the gold and did not replace it. And the shell is exactly the sort of thing that never travels. It is regional, it is specific to a people, and it means nothing outside its own world. When the two halves of humanity met, no Spaniard cared about the shell at all. They both understood the gold immediately. That is the difference between a cultural preference and a physical fact, and the two were sitting side by side in the same civilization, so we can compare them directly. We treat the value of gold as the great example of a shared illusion. It is the stock example. People say, quite confidently, that gold is only worth something because we all agree it is, that it is a collective fiction we have chosen to sustain, and that there is nothing underneath it. The Inca say otherwise. They could not have inherited our agreement because they had never met us. They could not have been persuaded by our markets because they had no markets. They arrived at the same conclusion from a standing start, on the other side of the world, with nothing in common with us but a species and a periodic table. You cannot independently reinvent an arbitrary convention. If two isolated populations reach the same answer, the answer was not arbitrary. Which does not make gold objectively valuable in some cosmic sense. it makes it something more interesting. It means the value is not in the metal and not in the culture, but in the fit between the metal and us, between what human beings need a precious substance to do, and the fact that exactly one element on the table can do all of it at once. We did not agree that gold was precious. We noticed, and that discovery, made twice, on 2 continents, by peoples who had never heard of each other, was about to become the most catastrophic coincidence in human history. Because in 1532, the 2 halves of the world finally met, and one of them arrived knowing exactly what the other one had. On the 16th of November 1532, in a mountain town in what is now northern Peru, 168 Spaniards met an emperor. The numbers are worth saying slowly, because they sound like an error. Francisco Pizarro had 168 men. 62 of them had horses. Atahualpa, ruler of an empire that ran 4,000 kilometers down the spine of a continent and governed something like 10 million people, had an army in the valley outside, numbering in the tens of thousands. Atahualpa had just won a civil war against his own brother. He was at the height of his power, in his own country, surrounded by his own soldiers, and he had allowed a small band of exhausted foreigners into the town square because he was curious about them and did not consider them a threat. By the end of that afternoon, he was a prisoner, and thousands of his people were dead. We are not going to spend this chapter on how that happened, because it is a story about horses and steel and disease and timing, and it is told elsewhere. What matters here is what happened next, because it is the single clearest measurement anybody has ever taken of what gold is worth. Atahualpa, held in a room in Cajamarca, worked out very quickly what these men actually wanted. He had watched them. He had seen that they were not interested in the temples themselves, or the cloth, which in his own culture was the truly precious material, or the food, or the land. He had seen what happened to their faces around metal. So he made an offer. He said he would fill the room he was standing in with gold, as high as he could reach, and 2 further rooms with silver. In exchange, they would let him go. There is a line, still visible today on the wall of a surviving building in Cajamarca, marking where the offer was set. The room is around 7 meters by 5. The line is above head height. The Spanish agreed and almost certainly did not believe he could do it. Over the following months, it came in. Llama trains moving along the extraordinary Inca road network from every corner of the empire, gold from temples, gold from palaces, sheets stripped from the walls of the Sun Temple at Cusco, the gold gardens, the models of maize, the ceremonial vessels, the funeral masks, the work of centuries of the finest goldsmiths in the Americas. And as each shipment arrived, the Spanish melted it. That is the detail worth sitting with. Nobody looked at these objects and thought about what they were. They were fed into furnaces set up in Cajamarca and reduced to bars, because bars are countable, divisible and portable, and a gold llama is none of those things. 9 forges are said to have worked for weeks. The finest body of gold work in the Americas was destroyed in a matter of months, and what we know about it, we know almost entirely from a handful of pieces that were sent to Spain intact as curiosities, and from what people wrote down. The final tally was in the region of 6,000 kilograms of gold, and roughly double that in silver. 6 tons it remains by a wide margin, the largest ransom ever paid by anybody for anybody. Atahualpa fulfilled the agreement. In July of 1533, he was tried by his captors on charges including revolt and idolatry, condemned and garroted in the square at Cajamarca. He had paid the largest sum in human history for his life, in full, on time, and it bought him about 8 months. Now, why does this belong in a video about a metal rather than a video about conquest? Because of what it reveals about the exchange rate between the two halves of the world, and because of what happened to the winners. Look at what was traded. On one side, 6 tons of gold and 12 of silver, representing the accumulated sacred wealth of an entire civilization. On the other, the life of one man, and not even that. Both sides in that room agreed the metal was valuable. That is the whole point of the previous chapter. They did not need to be taught, but they valued it for completely different reasons, and the mismatch is the tragedy. To Atahualpa, gold was sacred and it was abundant. His empire had a great deal of it, and no market to sell it in. He could give away 6 tons of holy objects, the way a man might give away the fittings of a building. Costly, painful, but replaceable, and obviously worth less than an emperor. To the Spanish, gold was money, and money was the only reason any of them had crossed an ocean. He was trading a religious material for his life. They were being handed a fortune beyond any of their imaginations by a man they had already decided to kill. And then the gold went home, and this is the part that turns the chapter. Spain in the 16th century received the largest windfall of precious metal in recorded history. Not just Cajamarca, decades of it from mines across the Americas, including one mountain of silver so productive that it deserves and has been given its own telling elsewhere. Fleets crossed every year loaded. Spain became, on paper, the richest state in Europe by an enormous margin. And it went bankrupt. Repeatedly. The Spanish crown defaulted on its debt something like 12 times in the following century and a half.
Reasons are argued over, and any economist will give you a longer list, but the core of it is not complicated.
When you flood a country with money without increasing the amount of goods that money can buy, you do not make the country richer. You make the money cheaper. Prices across Spain and then across Europe rose steadily for a century. Worse, the money did not stay. It paid for wars in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Sure, it paid for imports because it was easier to buy manufactured goods from abroad than to make them at home. Spanish industry withered because why build a workshop when the fleet is coming? The gold and silver flowed through Spain like water, through a pipe, and ended up in the hands of the Dutch and the Genoese and the English, who had actual things to sell. There is a phrase from the period that Spain was the mouth that took the gold in and passed it on. So the reversal in this chapter is the largest in the whole story. The two greatest concentrations of gold in human history, the Inca horde and the Spanish Empire that seized it, both ended in ruin. One was destroyed by the men who wanted its metal. The other was hollowed out by receiving it. Getting all the gold made, Spain poor. Because gold is not wealth. This is the thing that 400 years of adventure stories have made it very hard to see clearly. Gold is a claim on wealth. It is a way of holding value that somebody else created. And if nobody is creating any, then having more of the claims does not help you at all. The Inca had understood something about it that the Spanish did not. Though it did them no good whatsoever, they knew gold was not useful. That was why they gave it to the gods and to the dead, and put it on walls, and never once tried to eat off it. Which brings us to the last great chapter of gold as an object of pursuit, and to the strangest thing about it. Because after Cajamarca, the idea took hold in Europe that somewhere out there was a place where gold simply lay on the ground waiting to be picked up, that a man with nothing could go and become rich, not by inheriting or trading or conquering, but by walking somewhere and looking down. For 300 years, that was a fantasy that killed people in South American jungles. And then, in 1848, at a sawmill in California, it turned out to be true. A rush is not really about the gold. That sounds like a paradox, and it is not. It is the single most consistent finding in the whole history of gold mining. It held true on 3 continents in 3 different decades, and almost nobody who went knew it before they left. Start with the morning it began. In January 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was building a sawmill on the American River in California for a landowner named John Sutter. He was inspecting the tail race, the channel that carried water away from the wheel, and he saw something bright in the gravel. He picked it up. It was soft, and it could be hammered flat rather than shattering, which is the field test for gold, because most bright things in a riverbed are not. Marshall took it to Sutter, and the 2 men tried very hard to keep it quiet, for the obvious reason that a landowner with a working farm does not want 10,000 strangers digging up his fields. They failed within months, and the man who broke it open was not a miner at all. Samuel Brannan ran a store near the fort. He heard the rumors, and instead of going to dig, he quietly bought every pick, pan, shovel, and length of rope in the region. Then he walked through the streets of San Francisco holding a bottle of gold dust above his head and shouting that there was gold on the American River. He is generally reckoned to have become the first millionaire of the California gold rush, and he never mined an ounce. He simply owned all the shovels in a place that was about to need shovels very badly. That is the pattern, stated on day 1 by the man who started the stampede. What followed was one of the largest voluntary migrations in history. Something like 300,000 people came to California in the following few years, from the eastern United States, from Mexico, from Chile, from Ireland, from China, from Australia. They came by ship around the whole of South America, a voyage of 5 or 6 months. They came across the isthmus at Panama through Fever Country, where a great many of them stopped permanently. They came overland across 2,000 miles of plain and desert and mountain. And what did they find? And what did they find? In the first year or 2, genuinely astonishing luck. The early arrivals were working ground that had never been touched, and a man with a pan could sometimes make in a day what he would have earned in 6 months at home. That period lasted about 18 months. After that, the easy surface gold was gone, and what remained required equipment, water rights, capital, and eventually machinery that no individual could afford. Within a decade, the work was industrial, and the men who had come to be independent were employees. Meanwhile, the cost of living in the goldfields had gone insane. which is where the money actually was. Eggs sold for prices that would have bought a dozen in New York. A shovel that cost $1 in the East could fetch many times that at the diggings. Laundry was so expensive in San Francisco that shirts were reportedly shipped to Hawaii and back to be washed, which sounds like a tall tale and was cheaper than washing them locally. Every one of those prices is a transfer from a miner to a merchant. The names that survived from California are almost all merchants. A young man arrived selling dry goods to miners, and his company, which eventually made hard-wearing trousers with metal rivets for men doing heavy work in wet conditions, is still one of the most recognizable clothing brands on earth. The gold went. The trousers stayed. Two men who started a bank and a freight business to move miners' gold safely built a company that is still a household name today. None of these fortunes came out of the ground. All of them came out of the pockets of the people who were trying to get things out of the ground. Then it happened again, and the second time was worse. In 1896, gold was found on a tributary of the Klondike River in the far northwest of Canada, in a place where winter lasts most of the year and the ground is frozen solid to a depth of many meters. News reached the outside world in the summer of 1897, when ships docked in Seattle and San Francisco, carrying men who had come out with a great deal of gold. The timing mattered enormously, because the United States was in the middle of a serious economic depression, and a very large number of people had nothing to lose. Perhaps 100,000 set out. Around 30 or 40,000 actually made it. The route ran through mountain passes above the Alaskan coast, and the Canadian authorities, having seen what starvation does to a mining camp, imposed a rule. Nobody was allowed over the pass without a ton of supplies, roughly a year's food and equipment. A ton, carried on your own back in stages, up a staircase cut into ice and snow, in a queue of men that moved continuously, 30 or 40 trips up the same slope. There are photographs of that queue, and they are among the strangest images of the 19th century. A single, unbroken black line of human beings climbing a white mountainside, nose to tail, with no gaps, going up. Then a series of lakes, then boats they built themselves, then several hundred miles of river. By the time most of them arrived, in the summer of 1898, every worthwhile claim along the creeks had been staked for over a year. They had crossed a subarctic wilderness, carrying a ton of goods, each to reach a place where there was nothing left to claim. Of the 100,000 who set out, a few hundred became genuinely rich. Most of those lost it again. And the ton of supplies, of course, had to be bought, in Seattle mostly, which boomed on the back of a gold rush 1,000 miles away in another country. Seattle got rich by selling the bean. The same thing was happening in South Africa in the same decades on the Witwatersrand, where the reef discovered in 1886 turned out to be the largest gold deposit ever found, and where, because the ore was low grade and deep, there was never any individual phase at all. It went straight to deep shaft industrial mining, with African labour on the rock face and shareholders in London, and it built a city out of nothing. So the reversal is the same on 3 continents, and it is worth naming precisely. The gold rush is one of the great stories of individual opportunity. That is what it means in the popular imagination. The one moment in the industrial age when an ordinary man with no capital could simply go and get rich. And in every documented case, the wealth ended up concentrated in the hands of people who never touched a pan. Merchants, outfitters, shippers, bankers, landlords, and eventually mining companies. The rush transferred money from thousands of poor men to a few well-positioned ones, using the promise of independence as the mechanism. The dream of escaping the system was, in practice, the most efficient recruiting tool the system ever had. And notice what had happened to gold itself along the way. At Varna it was sacred. In Egypt it made a man permanent. In Lydia it became a coin. In Cajamarca it bought a life and failed too. By the 1800s it had become something new and much colder. It was a resource. Something located, extracted, processed, transported, refined and delivered by companies on a schedule with shareholders. The metal had not changed at all. Nothing about it ever changes. What changed was what we were doing with it, and by the end of the 19th century, we were doing something entirely unprecedented. We were about to build the entire financial system of the planet on top of it, and then discover that there was not enough. By the beginning of the 20th century, gold was no longer a metal, it had become a rule book. The way that happened is worth tracing quickly, because it starts with a man who was not thinking about money at all. In 1717, Isaac Newton was master of the Royal Mint. He had left mathematics behind and was running the coinage of a country, which he did with the same seriousness he had brought to everything else, including personally pursuing counterfeiters through London taverns. Newton set the official rate at which the mint would exchange gold and silver. He set the price of gold slightly too high relative to silver, and the consequence was mechanical and unstoppable. Silver was worth more as metal than as coin, so silver coins were melted down and shipped abroad, and gold stayed. Britain drifted onto a gold standard by accident, because of an arithmetic error by the greatest scientist alive. It was formalized a century later, and through the 1800s, as Britain became the center of world trade, everyone who wanted to trade with Britain adopted the same rule. By 1900, most of the world's major economies had done it, and the system was genuinely elegant. Every currency was defined as a fixed weight of gold, which meant every currency had a fixed relationship to every other one, which meant international trade could happen without anybody having to trust anybody's politics. And crucially, no government could print its way out of a problem. The money supply was tethered to a metal nobody could manufacture. That is the discipline gold imposes, and its admirers are right that it is real. Then came the First World War, and everybody suspended the rules, because you cannot fight a war of that size on money you are not allowed to create. And when it ended, Germany was presented with a bill. The reparations demanded of Germany were enormous, a sum that was to be paid, ultimately in gold or its equivalent, over decades. It was more gold than Germany had, more than Germany could earn, and by many economists' reckoning at the time, more than made any sense. Which is where one of the strangest projects in the history of science begin.
Fruit power was by any measure one of the most consequential chemists who has ever lived, and one of the most difficult to think about.
He had solved the greatest chemical problem of the age. He worked out how to take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia, which meant fertilizer could be manufactured rather than mined. which meant crop yields could rise beyond what the natural nitrogen cycle allowed. It is not an exaggeration to say that a large fraction of the people alive today are alive because of that process. It is arguably the single most important chemical discovery ever made. The same man then personally directed the development and first use of poison gas as a weapon on the Western Front and stood in the field to supervise it. His wife, herself a chemist, killed herself with his service pistol days after the first chlorine attack. He left for the Eastern Front the following morning. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, which caused a considerable amount of protest. And after the war, this man, a patriot, publicly humiliated, watching his country buried under a debt it could not pay, decided he would solve it. He would extract gold from seawater. The idea was not absurd on its face, and that is what makes the story so good. There genuinely is gold dissolved in the ocean. It is one of the reasons the sea is such an interesting place chemically. Over billions of years, rivers have carried traces of nearly everything into it. And the ocean is enormous. Any concentration, however small, multiplied across all the water on Earth, gives a total that is genuinely vast. There is more gold in the sea than has ever been mined in human history. The published figures available to Haber suggested a workable concentration. If those figures were right, Germany's debt could be paid out of the Atlantic. So he set it up with complete seriousness and in secret. A laboratory was fitted out aboard a ship. From 1923, he and his team sailed, sampling seawater across the Atlantic, developing methods with centrifuges and chemical treatments, refining their measurements as they went. It was a proper scientific expedition run by a first-rate scientist with a real chance of success. And the more carefully they measured, the smaller the number got. The earlier published estimates, it turned out, had been badly wrong, inflated by contamination and by the sheer difficulty of detecting something present in such tiny amounts. Haber's own careful figures came in lower and lower and eventually settled at something on the order of 1,000 times less than the value the whole project had been built on. At that concentration, the energy and equipment needed to process the water cost far more than the gold you would recover. Not marginally, absurdly. The gold is really there. There is just so much water in between that getting it out costs more than it is worth, and always will. Haber shut the project down around 1926. He died in exile in 1934, having been forced out of Germany by the racial laws of a government that would later use a pesticide developed at his Institute for Mass Murder on people including members of his own extended family. Now the reversal, and it is bigger and bigger. Thou and the God you paints them not Now the reversal, and it is bigger than one man. Haber was trying to answer the question this whole video has been circling, and he was doing it from the only direction anyone ever can. If gold is valuable because it is scarce, then solve the scarcity. Make more. Alchemists spent 1,500 years on the same problem and got nowhere. Because you cannot rearrange one element into another by chemistry that requires nuclear physics, and we can now genuinely do it. Gold has been made in reactors and accelerators, in quantities measured in atoms, at a cost that makes seawater look like a bargain. Says Feed Bureau recommends Fiaca, is experienced. That for no po kindly better keep it the money. which is not a coincidence. It is the property that made gold win in the first place, showing up one more time. Gold is scarce in a specific and very stable way, scarce enough to be worth something, available enough to exist, and impossible to increase quickly, no matter how badly anyone wants to. That is exactly what a money system needs, and exactly why a money system cannot be rescued by it in a crisis. Because here is what the 20th century discovered. The world was growing faster than the gold supply. Economies expand, populations grow, trade multiplies, and the amount of gold coming out of the ground each year does not care about any of that. A system tied to gold cannot expand when it needs to. In a depression, when what an economy desperately needs is more money in circulation, the gold standard says no. That discipline, which is the whole point of it, is also a set of handcuffs in exactly the moment you want your hands free. Country after country came off it during the 1930s, and the ones that came off earliest recovered fastest. A new system was built at Bretton Woods in 1944, and it was gold at one remove. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone was convertible into gold at $35 an ounce for foreign government. That held for 27 years. Then the United States found itself with far more dollars in circulation than gold in the vaults, and other governments began asking to convert. In August 1971, President Nixon closed the window, announced on a Sunday evening, presented as temporary. That was the end of a 5,000-year run. Since that day, not one currency anywhere on Earth has been redeemable for gold, and money has been a pure promise, backed by nothing but the state that issues it. The metal was finally completely unnecessary. Which raises the last question, and it is the one that makes no sense at all if you have been listening to this as a story about money. If gold has no monetary role anymore, if it backs nothing, redeems nothing, and settles nothing, then why has the world spent the last 50 years digging up more of it than ever before? There is a room under the southern end of Manhattan, about 80 feet below the street, cut into the bedrock the island is built on. Sweet. It had to be bedrock. Nothing softer would take the weight. Inside are 120 or so numbered compartments, separated by wire and stone, and inside those are stacks of gold bars. The bars are stacked by hand because no machine has ever been designed for the job that does it better, and the men who move them wear magnesium overshoes, because a bar weighs about 12.5 kilograms, and it will break a foot without noticing. The main vault door is a steel cylinder that turns to seal, weighing on the order of 90 tons. Most of the gold in that room does not belong to the United States. It belongs to other countries, dozens of them, foreign governments and international institutions who keep it there because it is safe and because everyone else does. And here is the part that says everything. When one of those countries pays another in gold, the gold does not go anywhere. Staff take the bars off one stack, wheel them a few meters across the floor, and stack them in a different numbered compartment. Nation A has less gold. Nation B has more. Nothing has left the room. Nothing has been near daylight. An international transaction, settled in the oldest money on Earth, consists of moving metal from one cage to the next cage. That is where 5,000 years of this story has arrived, and this chapter is about how much of it there is, where the rest sits, and why on earth we are still doing it. Start with the total. All the gold ever mined by all of humanity, from the riverbeds of Varna to the deep shafts running 4 kilometers under Johannesburg, all of it, everything, every ring and coin and bar and tooth and circuit board comes to somewhere around 220,000 ton. Melt it and cast it as a single cube, and that cube would be about 22 meters on a side. Say that again, because it is the most useful fact in the whole video. Everything. Every gram anyone has ever found. A cube that would fit comfortably inside a decent cathedral or on a tennis court with room to walk around it. 5,000 years of digging on 6 continents by every civilization that ever lived, and the entire result would sit under one roof. Now the second number, which is the one that should stop you. Roughly 2/3 of that has been mined since 1950. 2/3 since the middle of the last century. Which is to say that Egypt and Rome and the Inca and California and the Klondike, all of it together, the whole heroic and murderous history of gold, accounts for about 1/3 of the pile. The rest is ours. It came out of the ground in the era of the excavator, and the cyanide leach, and the open pit, in the same decades in which gold quietly stopped being money at all. We abolished its purpose, and then tripled the supply. So where is it? Roughly half is jewellery, and that half is overwhelmingly not in the West. India and China hold enormous quantities of it, much of it in households, in the form of ornaments that function simultaneously as decoration, as a woman's own property in societies where that has mattered a great deal, and as savings that survive a bank failure. That is a straight line back to Varna. Wealth on the body, portable, imperishable, yours. Somewhere around 1/5 sits in the vaults of central banks and governments in New York and London and Frankfurt and Beijing, and in a place in Kentucky whose name has become shorthand for security itself. And here is the strange thing about that 1/5. After decades of selling it off, central banks began buying again, heavily, in this century. Institutions that officially regard gold as a relic have been quietly accumulating it at the fastest rate in half a century. They will tell you it is for diversification, which is true and is not the whole answer. The whole answer is that, in a genuine emergency, a war, a collapse, a sanction that freezes your foreign reserves, gold is the only asset that is not somebody else's promise. That ever do nílim beacopt, and am a thick in general when tucking cattle on long and graffian of ab melisach. Crazy, wouldn't jack you on literal arpeggio on the brain of nothing. It is just there. A small remainder, a few percent, does actual work. There is gold in essentially every phone, computer and satellite ever built. In the contacts and the connectors because it conducts well, and, the same property again, for the last time, it does not corrode. A corroded connection fails, a gold one does not. It is the only genuinely industrial use it has ever had, and it has arrived in the last 70 years. After 5,000 years of it doing nothing. And a little of it is in medicine and in the mirrors of space telescopes, coated in a layer of gold a few atoms thick, out beyond the moon, looking at the light of the collisions that made it. Now the mining continues. Roughly 3,000 tons a year come out of the ground. The scale of what that costs is difficult to convey, so take the single clearest figure. To extract enough gold for one wedding ring, the industry moves something on the order of 20 tons of rock. 20 tons for a ring.
Focus rest is wrong.
To win the firm.
Only a crutch varies. The story of the frontier left behind as tailings, enormous engineered ponds of contaminated slurry that must be maintained, in some cases indefinitely, because when a tailings dam fails, it destroys everything downstream of it.
And in parallel, perhaps a fifth of the world's gold now comes from small-scale and informal mining, worked by millions of people, often with mercury, often by hand, often by children. Mercury is how you separate gold cheaply. It is also a potent neurotoxin, and it does not leave the rivers it enters. The description of the Egyptian mines from chapter 4, people underground, in heat, in danger, for someone else's metal, has not stopped being accurate. It has only moved. So put the whole thing together, and here is the turn this video has been walking toward for 2 hours. The gold comes out of the ground at appalling human and environmental cost. It is refined, cast into bars, shipped under guard, and put into a reinforced chamber cut into rock, underground, in the dark, behind a 90-ton door, with armed men outside. Which is to say, we take it out of a hole in the ground, and we put it in a hole in the ground. The only difference is the second hole has a better lock. And in that vault, it does nothing. It does not earn interest, it produces no crops and powers no machines. It is not used or worn or spent. It sits in the dark, being exactly what it was when two dead stars collided. Exactly what it was in a grave in Bulgaria 6,500 years ago. Exactly what it was in the tomb of a 19-year-old pharaoh. Left unchanged, unreactive, doing nothing whatsoever. And that is not the failure of the system. That is the product. That is what we are paying for. We move 20 tons of rock and poison a river to obtain a small quantity of the one substance on Earth that is guaranteed to do nothing at all. And then we pay guards to make sure it goes on doing nothing. The uselessness was never the joke at the end of the story. The uselessness was the specification. So, why gold? Not because we decided that is the part that took 2 hours to arrive at, and it is the part worth keeping. There were about 98 elements available. The gases could not be carried and the liquids could not be held. The reactive metals burned in water. The radioactive ones decayed and poisoned whoever kept them. Some were lying around everywhere, and some barely existed at all. And most of the rest could not be melted in any fire a human being could build. What survived was 2, and one of them tarnishes. There is Edith sing relaxed to the room. We hold you stek and sea maids. Egypt and the Inca had no contact, no shared language, no shared gods, and no shared ancestors for 15,000 years. And both of them looked at the only yellow imperishable metal on Earth and said the same thing about it, that it came from the sun. They were not agreeing with each other. They were both agreeing with the periodic table. And what they had found was a substance whose single defining quality is that it will not participate in anything. It does not rust. It does not burn. It will not combine, corrode, tarnish, rot, or change. Iron built every bridge and every ship and every rail in the world, and iron is worth almost nothing, and iron is eaten by the rain. Gold built nothing. In 5,000 years it did not do one useful thing until we started putting it in telephones, and it is the only material our species has never once been able to put down. The uselessness is not a flaw in the story. The uselessness is the whole of the story. We needed something that would hold still, something that would not become anything else while we were not looking, that would still be there unchanged when we or our children came back for it. There was exactly one candidate. It was made in a catastrophe before the sun existed, delivered here late and by accident, and it has been sitting on this planet ever since, waiting, doing nothing. A man at Varna was buried in it 6,500 years ago, and his people and their language and everything they built are gone, so completely that we do not know what to call them. The gold came out of that soil, looking new. A boy in Egypt was given a face of it so that he would not rot. He did not. An emperor in Peru filled a room with it to a line above his own head and was killed anyway, and the room is still there and the line is still on the wall. And now we take it out of one hole in the ground so that we can seal it in another 80 feet down, behind a door weighing 90 tons, and pay men to stand outside and make sure that it continues, faithfully, to do nothing at all. 5,000 years of digging it out of the ground so that we could put it back in the ground, somewhere safer, with a guard on the door. That is the whole history of the most valuable substance on Earth. There is a kind of quiet that only arrives late in the evening, when the house has stopped moving and the last of the light has gone from the windows. Tonight, we are going to follow one long story, slowly, from the beginning. You do not need to hold on to anything earlier, and every part of it stands on its own. Whatever else was true of the people in this story, and a great deal of it was cruel, and a great deal of it was foolish, they were all reaching for the same thing, and it was not really the metal. They wanted something that would last, something that would still be there afterwards. That is what the man at Varna was saying, and the boy in the mask, and the emperor in the room, and every central bank quietly buying this year. They were all making the same bet against time, using the only object anyone has ever found that reliably wins it. And it is still winning. Tonight, in the dark, under the rock. The gold in that vault has not changed since two dead stars fell into each other 130 million years ago. It did not change while Egypt rose and fell. It did not change while Rome emptied its own coins, or while 100,000 people walked over a frozen pass toward a river with nothing left in it. It will not change tonight either. It will simply sit there in the dark, being exactly what it is, the way it has since before there was a sun to be the flesh of. There is a kind of quiet that only arrives late in the evening, when the house has stopped moving and the last of the light has gone from the windows. Tonight, we are going to follow one long story. Let us the fire go down, and let the room get dark, and let it all keep for the morning. Sleep well.